Welcome back, Geordies. It's Adam from Two for Joy, and this video is basically based around off the back of my last video with regards to SCR, squad cost ratios, and how the Premier League is set up. And this video is basically going to be my opinion on the growth of Newcastle and how it's being hampered by the Premier League with rule changes. And this could work for Aston Villa or basically any of the other 14 teams in the Premier League, excluding the Big Six. And what I'd like to say is, basically, let's be honest, for years the Premier League has basically revolved around one group of clubs, the so-called Big Six, and they have had all of the money, the spotlight, the prime TV slots, global fan bases. That's been the story probably for the last, 15 years since Man City took over. And now Newcastle are trying to break into that establishment, as are Aston Villa. And suddenly it looks like doors are being closed and roads are getting steeper. So the question is the system really set up for anyone to rise within this system, or is it designed to keep the same clubs at the top? And I just basically want to look at that as a whole and then make 4 points. I've got 4 points and I'll show some statistics on sponsorships and commercial revenues and so on and so forth. But it's a different era. Point one, different era, different rules. And basically, if you look at Manchester City and Chelsea, when their takeovers happened, there was a completely different set of financial rules in place and they weren't as tightly enforced. The commercial side of football wasn't under the microscope it's under now, and they were able to invest. Their owners were able to invest heavy in order to make them grow quickly and secure massive sponsorships and build global brands without the level of scrutiny that certain clubs might receive today. So over a 15-year period, that turned into a huge commercial revenue and massive broadcast pools and made these teams regular Champions League mainstays, which obviously offered them really fast financial growth. Now, Newcastle, the same as Aston Villa, have the same ambition with the same kind of ownerships and backing, but they're trying under a much stricter environment. So it's kind of like turning up to a party after the doors have been locked. And point two, profit and sustainability, FFP, SCR, whatever we're going to call it. On paper, they're about keeping clubs financially responsible because no one wants to see a club go bust. But the timing of this matters. And basically, when the Newcastle takeover happened, the enforcement of rules became a lot sharper, a lot quicker. So sponsorship deals were examined for fair market value, whereas they weren't previously in past seasons. And questions have been raised over partnerships with inflated prices. Every commercial deal seems to need to have a second opinion. And in most other lines of business, this doesn't happen. There isn't the scrutiny that there is in the level of football. And meanwhile, other clubs have built foundations for a new era of football. And the level of scrutiny just wasn't there. So now it's about saying rules should have existed, but because they didn't, clubs were allowed to climb and their potential future looked different, very different to how ours looks. So the biggest point of this, my point three, is the Big Six and TV revenues. And here's kind of where it gets interesting, because the Premier League itself globally pulls on big fixtures, big rivalries and big brands. Manchester United, Liverpool, Arsenal, City, Chelsea, if we can put it in there, Spurs. And the broadcasters pay billions of pounds to those clubs for pulling viewers in worldwide. That's the reality. They get more fixtures on television than other teams. They influence the global brand that is the Premier League more than other teams, understandably, and they will want their slice of the pie for doing so. But if a new club starts to break into that space, that changes the balance, and it shifts the attention, it shifts the power, it shifts the revenue influence. So from a business perspective, the league has every incentive to protect the brands that have already driven them to this global audience. The familiar faces, they're safer than new challengers. And does that mean that Newcastle can't grow? No, it doesn't. But it does mean that the system naturally leans toward protecting the established names. You could definitely make a case for that. And the way this protection of their ecosystem goes is, when City and Chelsea rose, the league was evolving. It was building basically an identity across the world, you know, in the same way that back in the early 90s, Serie A was huge, and then La Liga became the priority when Real Madrid were buying the Galacticos, and there was the big Barcelona, Messi, Ronaldo, that whole ecosystem. They drew massive revenues. And now the Premier League is the polished product. It's worth billions of pounds. It's an ecosystem built around certain pillars, which are these 6 clubs. And in my opinion, changing that structure carries risk. You risk losing the TV revenues if this 6 teams, the big shiny front door of the Premier League, is diluted down, and that there is more competition and more teams that are able to challenge. So when Newcastle start climbing quickly and our revenues grow in such a quick manner, the response isn't great. It ends up as, oh, let's have another powerhouse. Newcastle are just going to buy their way through the league. So there's caution and oversight and a tight enforcement from the Premier League. Not because Newcastle have done something wrong, but because of how the system is built to protect the stability and stop disruption from the established teams. So essentially what I'm saying is, this isn't about Newcastle's ambition. The investment isn't the issue. The fan base definitely isn't the issue. The real debate is whether the current rules or the new rules that are going to be brought in are going to offer teams a pathway to be able to establish themselves as a big club in this league, or whether your path is going to be rerouted to something a lot more difficult in order to break into this mould of Big 6 clubs. And this isn't about shouting corruption within the Premier League. It's about asking fair questions. And if the door was open before, why it should be pushed ajar now. And more importantly, can Newcastle even make it through that doorway? So when I looked through, and I'll just pull up some stats. So the Manchester City, and I'll compare us to Man City purely because the backgrounds are similar. We both have owners from the Far East. And Sheikh Mansour is from the UEA. Obviously, he owns 81% of the City Group. And Man City have managed to grow at an incredible rate over the last 15 years. And I just wanted to have a look at basically some of their sponsorships and basically the way their sponsorships break down compared to our sponsorships. So initially, Obviously, Newcastle owned by PIF, we're Saudi Arabia. Man City, United Arab Emirates, very similar backgrounds. And Man City have had a more esteemed history in the recent future since the investment. And they've won, I think it's like nine titles, something like that, from the investment that's been put into them. But what really gets me is the breakdown of Premier League fair market value, because Manchester City are sponsored by Etihad Airways, which is an airline run from the United Arab Emirates, headquartered in the United Arab Emirates, and their front of shirt sponsor and stadium naming rights are their primary partner with Etihad. And this previously has been worth 60 million to 80 million pounds annually, and is now upwards of 90 plus million per year as part of a £1 billion long-term deal. And the same thing. So 2 of their other sponsors are also from United Arab Emirates. And United Arab Emirates based telecommunications company and global partner, who make contributions towards their sponsorships. But when I look at Newcastle's sponsorships, so Newcastle's front of shirt sponsor is Saudi Arabian company Seller. So a very similar deal, worth £25 million a year. A quarter of the revenue that Manchester City receive. And Manchester City's deal, when it was first put in place, had no fair market value test put against it. Whereas Newcastle's Seller deal was subject to the Premier League fair market value assessment. And both Seller and Newcastle being linked to the Saudi Public Investment Fund, the deal propelled Newcastle with a top tier shirt sponsor, though it remains way behind the values that are being bandied around for Manchester City. And what I don't understand is whether these restrictions are actually put in place, and I've said it before, are actually put in place to stop clubs going bust, or whether these restrictions are to slow growth to keep the established order of the Premier League. And it's my opinion. But like I've said many times before, I don't see a billion or $1 trillion public investment fund leaving Newcastle in a position where they can go bankrupt. And I would say, not the horse has already bolted, but I don't think the public investment fund would pump in millions and millions and millions of pounds, regardless of whether these rules were in place or not. And purely on the fact that if you look at their investment, and you look at pretty much every business that operates under the Saudi investment fund, they're there to make money. The investment fund has grown from 330 billion to 600 billion to over $1 trillion. And they've grown that revenue through making profitable business and good investments. What I would like to say from everybody in the Premier League is, if you were in the same position we were, do you think it's do you think the platform is fair as a whole? Because essentially what I think is going to happen from the squad cost ratios is smaller teams are going to be punished. And I mean this in the nicest possible way, but Newcastle will probably be all right Newcastle will probably pull through and be able to bring in certain sponsors and so on and so forth. But currently, Aston Villa, their wage cap is too high. Sunderland, their wage cap is too high. I believe Everton, Brighton, they're all in this remit of their wages over the course of a season. They may well be scrutinised for the amount of money they're spending. And the situation this leaves us in, and this is where it brings me on to the bigger topic of transfers and trying to keep homegrown players and players moving and the whole ecosystem of football changing, and essentially clubs selling players that we want to see, the homegrown talent, being sold for 100% profit. And this doesn't actually make sense to the football ecosystem. It doesn't actually drive anything apart from it drives money into the pockets of the big six. And what I would say is Tino Livramento will most likely move in this summer to Manchester City due to the fact that Newcastle can't offer the wages that Manchester City can offer. Anthony Gordon looks like he will most likely move to Liverpool if we're sticking to the scenario that's being bandied about as far as rumours are going. Sandro Tonali is being linked with Arsenal. Newcastle have one of the largest commercial revenues outside of the big six. So we should be able to hold on to our key players. But the way that this establishment runs, Manchester City are not even scratching the surface of the boundaries they can push to with their revenues coming in at near 700 million. One of the only clubs in 3 consecutive years to push £700 million through a football club. And as much as the established order of the big six teams, Liverpool aren't pushing that much revenue. Manchester United aren't pushing that much revenue. Arsenal aren't pushing that much revenue. They have more history. They are more established. They've been there longer. So why are Manchester City allowed to grow at the rate they are from the background they have with the investment they have from their owners, and that not be the case for Newcastle in such a similar circumstance? Let me know in the comments, guys. I think I'd like everybody to get involved and kind of debate this topic as whether you think this is good for football as a whole, or whether you feel that the rules are just being changed to suit the establishment. And I don't mean this as a dig at the big six teams. What I mean is, if Manchester City if they carry on growing at the rate they've been growing, we will become a one-horse race. Because even Liverpool spent 3 seasons without really making purchases in order to have this big window. Manchester City, with the rate their commercial side is growing, can pretty much spend what they want, when they want, how they want, and pay the biggest wages in the Premier League and not feel the pinch. And I know there's a big clash around the 115 charges that we will obviously take an eternity to see the outcome from. But essentially, they're not being affected by that right now in the way that other clubs such as Everton, Leicester, Notts Forest, who weren't in the position to fight their corners as well with the financial revenues that they have, were dealt with a lot quicker. They have felt the pinch of the Premier League's financial ruling, whereas Man City seem to be able to operate and continue as normal. Let me know in the comments. I think it's a really interesting topic. Let me know if you think I'm wrong on anything. And like I say, like, subscribe, and hopefully, guys, I've got some interesting topics around youth players that I'd like to talk about. I'm going to do another video based around homegrown prospects, homegrown talents, and the reason that homegrown talents won't stay at the clubs they started at, they support, and the way that this financial structure will always mean that those talents will have to move in order for football clubs to continue growing at the rates they're growing in order to meet this financial ruling. But yeah, like and subscribe, and hopefully, guys, I will see you in the next one.